Hello everybody, Spooky Bjorn here, or as most people just tend to call me on the internet, Bjorn. I am here today because a lot of my friends have actually requested that I teach them how I make my fantasy maps for fantasy worlds for my own stories as well as Dungeons & Dragons. So I figured it would be a good idea to actually just make a tutorial video that other people could reference as well. Here are some examples of maps that I've done for my own stories as well as Dungeons & Dragons. And as you can see, they all kind of have their own unique shape. They all have a lot of different things like mountains and trees that I've added in to give a better lay of the land. But I understand that making maps can actually be kind of difficult, so I just wanted to make this video to show you guys some easy tips and tricks for how I do the general design of my land, and also to help give you guys some ideas of how to break up like districts and kingdoms inside of some sort of fantasy continent or country. So to get the general shape that I want for the land, I go into Photoshop and I actually pick some sort of interesting watercolor brush. I tend to just download these from DeviantArt, free brush packs. You can find a ton of them. And I find one that I like, and then I go into my brush settings, and I go to shape dynamics, and I turn on pen pressure, and then I up the size jitter, and I go and I up the angle jitter 100%, and I actually do the roundness jitter just a little bit to give it a lot of different shapes. Then I go into scattering and up the scatter and up the count just a little bit. You also want to make sure to lower your opacity so you can get some more interesting shapes instead of just one big block of color. Then I like to just lightly tap the brush across the canvas and kind of see what interesting shapes it makes. I like to make it darker in some areas, but overall I like to kind of just like randomly tap the brush all across the canvas to see the different shapes that everything makes until it's just something that I like, and I like the general outline. Then I will make a new layer and just get the simple round brush, make sure that its settings are pen pressure and that I have no spacing so there's no weird bumps. And make sure you set the brush to 100, and then the new layer I like to just lightly kind of trace the outline of the shape that I've just made, making sure to you don't want to use too much control when you're making the shape of the land. You don't want to worry too much about the lines being perfectly smooth. I like to just kind of hold the very end of my tablet pen so my lines are a little bit more shaky, because then it makes the shape of the land feel more natural. And I like to just vaguely follow the outlines, maybe sometimes add more dips or circles or something, if I see fit. But I like to use the general bumpy, textury shape of that the brush has made to make the land, because I think it makes it more interesting and it makes everything feel more natural. Now, I think that this is a pretty good land shape. You want to remove the brush layer underneath just so you can get a better idea of what everything looks like. I think that this is a really good shape to start with for a continent. And now I'm going to go in and I'm going to start to basically draw off different borders for I think different kingdoms or countries would be. What feels right with the shape of the land and what makes sense for how I think that the countries would be divided up. Now, once I have the countries divided up, I'm now going to show you guys how to refine this large map more into, just blocking off one of the big kingdoms. I selected this shape just because it stood out to me. It's not too big, it's not too small. I feel like it's a good size to work with. So I'm just going to use the lasso tool to select it. I'm going to copy it and then paste it in a new layer and then enlarge it a lot so it's, easier to work with and easier to see. And here I'm just shading off that extra area so it's not too distracting. So now that I have this land shape blown up, I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to start adding mountains to get a better idea of the topology or the geography of this land. I don't know fancy land terms or anything. I just add what I think looks cool, honestly. It's a fantasy world. You can just say magic. But yeah, I just have custom made tree and mountain brushes that I use. It's just, little arrows basically for the mountains and little weird tree things, but it makes it a lot easier so you're not going in and drawing in each one individually, I also like to set some sort of jitter for the mountain brushes, just because when it's just like one big blocky mountain, I just think it doesn't look that great, so I like to have it so they vary a little bit in size. Nothing too much. But now I'm going to go in and I'm going to start adding mountains closer to the border of this country and the next one, because I see this as kind of like a mountainous coastal region, so maybe there would be more mountains the closer inland that it goes. And I'm just going to have the mountains kind of hug the border of this country and the next one. And as I'm doing this, I like to have the mountains sort of taper off along the borders. I don't want just one big cluster of mountains. I like to have them kind of focused in like a wide center, but I like to have them kind of taper off along the edges. I feel like it makes it look a little bit more natural. But that can also be personal preference. If you just like a big chunk of mountains, then hey, if that works for you, then go for it. Like, there's no really right or wrong way to make a fantasy map. This is just my preferred way. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to start adding some trees for the really big forests. For this landscape, I feel like it would probably be more deciduous forest the closer to the east, and the closer west and more inland that the forests get. I'd probably say that they'd maybe be more deciduous. Maybe it gets a little bit colder. Not deciduous, sorry, coniferous. More coniferous. But again, I kind of like to have the forest interspersed with the mountains a little bit. It just felt like it would make sense for this particular region. You know, they hug the coastline maybe a little bit, but then taper out because you're getting to the beaches. Like to have the forest concentrated in some areas and then taper out. But for this, I feel like it makes the most sense for the forest to be kind of closer to the mountainous regions. And then, I mean, not to say that there wouldn't be forests, sprinkled throughout this land, but it just seems like they'd probably be the most concentrated and noteworthy to be put on a map in these areas. And now I'm going to go in and I'm just going to add some like basic, rivers and maybe a lake. You don't have to do this, but this is something that I like to do. It helps me make more sense of the land. I usually just take a blue brush with a little bit lower opacity, so it's not like too bright and too distracting from the rest of the map. Maybe there's a stream that feeds into the ocean. I like to have the stream kind of taper off, almost like little, I imagine like little flashes of lightning or like tiny tree branches when I'm drawing the streams. But I think it's important if you want to think more about how, where cities and things are built in the country, because a lot of cities are going to be built where there's reliable sources of water. So I like to have some sort of streams and rivers going through, and then usually some sort of small or large lake. And maybe the stream comes from inland, and then it feeds into this big lake, and then that lake feeds into rivers that go out into the ocean. This from what I've have drawn, this would definitely be a town that's very reliant on trades with other countries. They probably have a lot of harbor towns. And then, like traveling through waterways would also probably be a big way that they would trade. But, it could, or maybe they just like water. I don't know. And now that I have the basic, mountains, streams, forests blocked out, I'm going to block off the different districts that would maybe be in this small country that's on the much larger continent. And I just kind of block them off based off of major geographical features, the lake, the long mountain range, the big forests, and then I'm going to number them just so it's easier to talk about each of them. Here I have numbered each of the sections that I have, drawn off, and I've also put, as you can see, there are some red dots, and then there's one star. I've used the red dots to symbolize where I think major cities would be, and then the star is where I think the capital city of this whole entire country would be. Let's start with Section 1. Section 1 is where most of the mountains are, and it's also closest to the mainland. So I thought that the major city in this blocked off region would probably be near the end, kind of on the border between this country and the next. Maybe the city is so major and it's so large because they do a lot of trade with the neighboring country. Maybe this would be, in Dungeons and Dragons, this could be a very large dwarf settlement with all of the mountains, and they do a lot of trade with all the precious ores and gems that they mine up. Leading into that, Section 2 has the most forests. Maybe if, again, going off of if this was in Dungeons and Dragons, this would be where a large elf settlement would be, a lot of wood elves, so their major city would kind of be near the end of the forest, but still somewhere where they would be nicely protected and maybe a little bit shut off from the rest of people, but not so far shut off that they wouldn't be able to make contact with the other kingdoms and the other races. And for number 3, I feel like having the capital city in the center of this country makes the most sense because they would be able to do trade. They'd be able to do trade fairly easily with everybody surrounding them in the country. Also, I feel like they would have the most major cities in total because they have the largest source of water in the country. And naturally, people are going to want to build where there's reliable sources of water, and then they have some forests, so there's going to be game and things that they can hunt for food, and there's going to be timber that they can use for houses. So I feel like even though it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, even just like having a body of water and some trees to show forests can actually make a lot of sense for where different cities would be placed. So moving on to number 4, honestly, I could have probably combined 4 and 5, but I just wanted to have more countries because I like having or have more kingdoms because I like to have a lot of kingdoms within a country. I think it makes it more fun and interesting. But then again, quantity doesn't always equal quality. But I just like having a lot of places. It made sense for me for some sort of major city to kind of be on the border of the mountains and the trees. Plenty of resources to build homes and cities, but also lots of protection from the elements. For number 5, again, just like with number 1, I feel like this would probably be a good idea for maybe like another dwarven settlement. Again, covered by the trees, lots of mountains, also kind of close to the coast. To do trade with other countries and continents that are in this fantasy world. And then for number 6 would definitely be the biggest of the port towns. Is because they're so far off to the coast, and this is where the major river in the country feeds out into the ocean. I feel like it would just make sense that there would be some cities along here that would have a lot of harbors and things like that. Nothing too fancy of an explanation, honestly. It's just what I felt personally would work for this country. I hope that these explanations helped you guys, and I hope that this tutorial helped you kind of figure out easier ways to draw maps and would give you ideas on how to add the different topology, geography for the maps, and also kind of a better idea of how to build cities and what would make most sense. So yeah, I hope this helped you. I hope you guys learned something. Feel free to comment with suggestions for what I could improve upon with this video, and also for other things that you'd like to see from me. Thanks for watching. Hope you tune in for other videos in the future.